raises it to a whole new level of intensity, because they were freaked out by this animating statues with stellar Demas thing that the Hermeticists were into. Yeah. Well, this is a good question, you know. I mean, when you're reading a 1,500-year-old account of a magical invocation, if we are to believe them, what happened was, by singing certain songs, burning certain incense, and performing these rituals at certain times that were astrologically correct, they could cause these things called decans, which are zodiacal demons of some sort. There are 3 decans to each zodiacal sign. See, modern astrology has completely, largely forgotten this. I mean, there are people who do decanic astrology, but you have to pay through the nose, because of course this is a lost and dying art. But they would somehow be able to draw these decans down into statue, and then they could extract knowledge from the statue. And you know, this would lay the basis for these sympathetic magics, which were then later developed in the Renaissance. It's quite powerful, actually. This is why this book I recommended is so interesting, the one on spiritual and demonic magic by Walker, because it shows you how, by living a certain life, you know, these Renaissance princes were incredibly wealthy. So you have a suite of apartments which overlook you know, the Plaza San Marco in Venice, and certain colors are prescribed that walls be painted. You only wear certain kinds of robes made of certain materials. You perform your magical invocations at certain times of day, burning certain incenses. They were big on fresh air and light. It isn't the dark image of magic that we get of, you know, the stirring cauldron and the bat-faced familiar and all that. No, it's all about open air, light, wind blowing through, flowing silk robes. They were angelic magicians, is what they were. And they were evoking things through the use of sigils, which are magical symbols. And then there being stress on magical alphabets. Enochian is one of these magical alphabets, or languages, rather. John Dee, remember I mentioned the whole 10-year episode with the Showstone. Well, one of the subjects these entities that Dee and Kelly were dealing with returned to again and again and again were the Enochian, this language, which they said was the true language that Abraham used to communicate with the angels. And it has a special alphabet, an alien alphabet, and there's been published an Enochian dictionary of some 4,000 or 5,000 words. There was a very bizarre, this is just a footnote, but a very bizarre episode in the mid-1950s. There was a woman who was a kind of clairvoyant, and she was in contact with flying saucers. I mean, now everybody and their dog is in contact with flying saucers, but that time it was fairly rare enough that she became an object of interest to the CIA. And at one point she was in the CIA building, Langley, Virginia, and we're interviewing her, and she said, well, there's a flying saucer right outside the window. And these guys rushed to the window and looked, and there was some kind of thing in the sky, and she said, it's giving me a message for you, for this colonel. And the message was Affa, 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 A-F-F-A. So he wrote this down. Well, and I didn't read it. I looked it up. I had a hunch. Affa is the Enochian word for nothingness. Just more weirdness.
finally realized to your astonishment, there is no way at all of having your mind anywhere else but in the present moment. Because even when you think about the past or the future, you're doing it now, aren't you? And that results in a very curious transformation of consciousness. You feel that the present moment is flowing on and carrying you with it all the time. Just like the flow of the Tao. The flow of the Tao is what we would call the flow of the present. See? And you're with it. There's nowhere anywhere else. The Zhongyong, the book called The Unwobbling Pivot, says the Tao is that from which one cannot deviate. That from which one can deviate is not the Tao. Or to put into the form of a Zen story, the master Joshu said to Nansen, "What is the Tao?" Nansen replied, "Your everyday mind is the Tao." Joshu asked, "How do you get into accord with it?" Nansen replied, "When you try to accord, you deviate." First of all, I'm going to talk about ideas which come strictly out of Lao Tzu's book, the Tao Te Ching. And, of course, basic thing in the whole philosophy